You are welcome to my educational video. Today I'll be addressing the topic respiration. And under respiration, what are we looking at? I'm looking at energy. For this video, I'm looking at the word energy. Now, energy has different forms. You have the kinetic energy. You also have the potential energy. The kinetic energy is the energy that is stored in a body that is moving. Is the energy found in a body that is moving or an object that is moving. While potential energy is the energy that is stored in a system, a stationary system. That means a body that is not moving or an object that is not moving. The energy stored in that object is known as potential energy. Now, in living cells like cells in human being, cells in animals, cells in plants, you have potential energy that is stored in us in form of chemical energy. Now, this energy, how do we generate them? How do we generate energy in living cells? You are aware that the cell is the place where energy is generated, and inside the cell you have the organelle known as mitochondria. That is the organelle that is meant for generation of energy. Now, in this picture, you are seeing a young man that is eating food. From there, I want to ask that what is respiration? Now, if you ask what is respiration, different students will give you or will come up with different opinion. Some they will tell you that respiration is breathing in, some will tell you it is breathing out, some will tell you it is eating food. But none of this is correct. To define respiration, you look at the concept of why do I eat or why do we eat? Why do we eat? Now, you look at respiration as being defined. Respiration can be defined as the process by which chemical energy in organic molecule is released to living cell in form of ATP. Now, the food you eat is an organic molecule, is an organic substance. That food contains chemical energy. So the process of making that energy available to your living cell, available to your tissues in form of ATP is known as respiration. Is known as respiration. Or better still, you can look at respiration as the process by which organic molecules are broken down in a series of stages to release chemical potential energy, which is used to synthesize ATP. I said earlier that the food we eat is referred to as organic substance. You can say organic molecule. So now for the food in that, for the energy in that food to be made available to your cells, to your living tissues in form of ATP, they has to undergo different reactions. It has to undergo series of stages, which include glycolysis, substrate link reaction, Krebs cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. All of this I'll discuss in details in my next video, but we are looking at respiration today and the word energy. I said earlier that energy is the capacity, the ability to do work, and where energy is generated in our cell is the mitochondria. That is the organelle in our cell that is used to synthesize energy. The energy there is referred to as ATP, and the full meaning of ATP is adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate. Now, the mechanism involved in synthesis of ATP, that means if you want to synthesize ATP in our mitochondria, in our living cell, what are the mechanisms involved? There are two major mechanisms that are involved in synthesis of ATP. One is substrate level phosphorylation. Substrate level phosphorylation. That means ADP and inorganic phosphate comes together to form ATP. ADP means adenosine diphosphate. Adenosine diphosphate. I said earlier that the food we eat is known as organic molecule or can be referred to as organic molecule. Now, this organic molecule in our cells or when they are being consumed, they are referred to as substrate. They are referred to as substrate. That means the phosphate you are adding to ADP, the phosphate, that's PI in my video, that you are adding to the ADP means comes from the substrate, comes from the organic molecule that you have eaten or the food you have eaten. So when you generate ATP directly from substrate, when you generate ATP directly by adding phosphate to ADP, that is one of the mechanism that is known as substrate level phosphorylation. The second mechanism is known as chemosmosis. Some other textbook or materials we refer to chemosmosis as oxidative phosphorylation. That is when ATP is generated using ATP synthase. ATP synthase is an enzyme. The synthase is spelled SYNTHASE. So it's an enzyme that is used to produce, or an enzyme that is used to synthesize ATP. And that enzyme makes use of energy that is generated across hydrogen ion gradient. That enzyme makes use of energy that is generated across a proton gradient, that is hydrogen ion gradient, but we prefer to use the word proton. So these are two major mechanisms by which ATP is synthesized in our living cell. Now, the substrate level phosphorylation will be discussed in details during glycolysis, while the chemosmosis will be discussed in details in my video on oxidative phosphorylation, or you can refer to as electron transport chain, one of the stages or the last stage during aerobic respiration. And now also note that both substrate level phosphorylation and chemosmosis takes place in aerobic respiration, takes place during aerobic respiration. Now, respiration can be two types. We have the aerobic respiration. We also have the anaerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration is the respiration that involves the use of oxygen, while anaerobic respiration is the respiration that doesn't require the use of oxygen. Now, the first equation you are seeing there, you can see glucose being added to oxygen. Glucose being added to oxygen to give you carbon dioxide and water. Glucose is oxidized by oxygen to give you carbon dioxide and water and energy. The glucose there is the organic molecule. The glucose there is the food you have eaten. It contains protein, carbohydrate, fat, and oil, vitamin, etc. Now, when you eat that food, the oxygen that you breathe in will go to oxidize it, and what you have will be carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The energy here is ATP, so please be careful. Just don't write the word energy. Standard exam will not mark the word energy. They prefer the word ATP, or you can say ATP energy. Now, the second equation represents anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration is respiration that takes place in the absence of oxygen, and you have two types of it. One is lactic acid fermentation. The second one is internal fermentation. Now, lactic acid fermentation, that's equation 2. That's when glucose is broken down to give you lactic acid and energy, ATP. It takes place in our muscles. It takes place in the absence of oxygen. Then the third equation there represents alcohol fermentation. That is when glucose, organic molecule, is broken down to generate ATP energy, ethanol, and carbon dioxide. And that is common in yeast cell. Now we move on to why do we need energy, or what are the role of energy? Now, I want us to know that this ATP we refer to, that's adenosine triphosphate, is soluble in water. That means it can undergo hydrolysis. it has a positive end, it has a negative end. The phosphate group there are the ones that carry the negative charge, and because it is polar, that means something that has a positive end and a negative end, they can dissolve in water, they can undergo hydrolysis. And once ATP undergo hydrolysis, that means ATP dissolves or is broken down, it will give you ADP and PI. The energy released during that process is the one that we use to carry out our daily activity. So the energy released, one, is used to carry out active transport of materials in every living cell. Active transport of materials in every living cell. Now you can ask, what is active transport? I will do a video on transport that will show you the different types of transports that you have in human being. You have active transport, you have passive transport. Now, active transport is when material move from region of low concentration to high concentration. So they need energy to move. They need energy to move. Another use of energy is for protein synthesis. That's in every living cell. Protein synthesis takes place in our body. Protein synthesis takes place. So you need energy to synthesize protein. Another use of energy is for DNA replication. Some material will say DNA duplication. That means you want to duplicate the numbers of DNA in your body, in your cell, in your system. Energy is required. Another requirement, another rule or reason why we need energy is for us to carry out movement. It's for muscle contraction. Just don't write the word movement in the exam. Write the word muscle contraction. As your muscle contracts and relax, then you begin to move. Contraction takes place at one end, relaxation takes place at another end. So energy is needed for muscle to contract. That contraction allows movement in our body, allows us to move our bones, our joints, and our joints. So energy is needed for muscle contraction. Another reason why we need energy, or why our body generates energy, is to maintain the body temperature. Is to maintain the body temperature. Lastly, why we also generate energy, or why we need to generate energy, is for electrical transmission of impulse. Electrical transmission of impulse that runs through our nerves from one end to another. So for that movement of nerve impulses or for that movement of nerve impulses, there is need for energy. Energy is needed. Now, I look briefly to the role of energy, as said, for protein synthesis, DNA replication, active transport, muscle contraction, body temperature, to maintain body temperature, and for transmission of nerve impulses. Now, the energy that we have been referring to, as said earlier, is known as ATP energy. That's adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate. Now, it's also expected of you as a student to know the structure of adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate has three major parts. One major part of it is the ribose sugar. The ribose sugar is a 5-carbon sugar. The ribose sugar is a 5-carbon sugar. And to the carbon, as you can see in my video, an adenine. Adenine is attached to one part of it. That's the nitrogenous base. You also have other nitrogenous bases like guanine, cytosine, thymine, uracil. But for ATP, it is adenine that is attached to the carbon. Then the carbon on the other end, you have triphosphate group attached to it. That is why we use the word triphosphate. You have triphosphate group attached to it. That's why we call it adenosine triphosphate. Now, this phosphate group are negatively charged. I think I said that earlier. Phosphate group are negatively charged. So for phosphate groups to come together, you need a lot of energy to hold them. You need a lot of energy to hold them together. And the bond that exists between this phosphate group is known as covalent bond, and that covalent bond is unstable. Because that covalent bond is unstable, that is why it is easy for the for adenosine triphosphate to dissolve in water. That is one. And also it has a charge end, that's the minus end. Now when hydrolysis of this phosphate group takes place, it is the third phosphate that is removed. And when that third phosphate is removed, energy is generated in that system. And that energy that is generated, it is the one that you use to carry out your daily activity, as I said earlier, either DNA replication that takes place in your cell, or protein synthesis that takes place in your cell, or muscle contraction in your body, other activity that you use energy to generate. Now, know that only small amount of ATP can be stored in your cell at a time. Your cell cannot store large quantity of ATP because the ATP are used to carry out daily activity that your cell require to carry out. But note that a lot of energy can be stored in fat, in carbohydrate, in protein. The protein you eat, the food you eat that contains fat, carbohydrate, and fat, etc., store a lot of chemical energy. And once you consume them, they come into your system stored either as fat in your body, or glycogen, or as protein. At that moment they can store a lot of ATP. But once it gets inside the cell to carry out activity, your cell can only store small amounts of ATP. Thank you for watching this video.